Hello and welcome again to another episode of Left to It All. I am your host, CM Phillips. Today we will be continuing with the Russian-Ukrainian Conflict Part 2, beginning with the US-backed coup in 2014 of former President Viktor Yanukovych and the Ukrainian Civil War that has been raging between Western and Eastern Ukraine, as well as Ukraine's Nazi problem. I know how some people may believe I am condoning Russia's illegal invasion in Ukraine because of how critical I am of Ukraine, the US and NATO. However, I do not condone war whatsoever. I am anti-war and anti-imperialist. Russia has broken international law, and the invasion is a war crime. The United States empire, however, breaks international law and commits war crimes so often it would take a lot of work for Russia to catch up to the big boys. I condemn it all, period. So let's begin. From Wikipedia. In November 2013, a wave of large-scale protests known as the Euromaidan erupted in response to President Yanukovych's sudden decision not to sign a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union, instead of choosing closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. In February of that year, the Ukrainian parliament had overwhelmingly approved of finalizing the agreements with the EU. These protests continued for months, and their scope widened, with calls for the resignation of Yanukovych and the Azarov government. Yanukovych and the leaders of the parliamentary opposition signed a resolution calling for the formation of an interim unity government, constitutional reforms, and early elections. Protesters opposed what they saw as widespread government corruption and abuse of power, the influence of oligarchs, police brutality, and the violation of human rights in Ukraine. Repressive anti-protest laws fueled further anger. A large barricaded protest camp occupied Independence Square in central Kiev throughout the Maidan uprising. The Revolution of Dignity, also known as the Maidan Revolution, took place in Ukraine in February 2014, and at the end of the Euromaidan protests, when deadly clashes between protesters and the security forces in the Ukraine capital of Kiev culminated in the ousting of elected president and former prime minister Viktor Yanukovych and the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. Russia considered the overthrow of Yanukovych to be an illegal coup and did not recognize the interim government. Widespread protests both for and against the revolution occurred in eastern and southern Ukraine, where Yanukovych previously received strong support in the 2010 presidential election. These protests escalated, resulting in a Russian military intervention, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and the creation of the self-proclaimed breakaway states of Donetsk and Luhansk. An article from the Grey Zone News. When a U.S.-backed government when a U.S.-backed government seized power in Kiev following the Euromaidan regime change operation of 2013-2014, Ukraine's government embarked on a nationwide purge of political elements deemed pro-Russian or insufficiently nationalistic. The passage of decommunization laws by the Ukrainian parliament further eased the persecution of leftist elements and the prosecution of activists for political speech. The post-Maidan regime has focused its wrath on Ukrainians who have advocated a peace settlement with pro-Russian separatists in the country's east, those who have documented human rights abuses by the Ukrainian military and members of communist organizations. Dissident elements have faced the constant threat of ultra-nationalistic violence, imprisonment, and even murder. The Ukrainian security service, known as the SBU, has served as the main enforcer of the post-Maidan government's campaign of domestic political repression. Pro-Western monitors, including the United Nations Office of the High Commissions, the UN, OHCR, and Human Rights Watch, have accused the SBU of systematically torturing political opponents and Ukrainian dissidents with near-total impunity. The UN OHCR founded in 2016 that arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, torture, ill treatment of such conflict-related detainees were common practice of the SBU. A former Kharkiv SBU officer explained for the SBU, the law virtually does not exist, as everything that is illegal can be either classified or explained by referring to state necessity. It's very vague at best, huh? This April, a vivid illustration of the SBU's brutality emerged in the form of a video showing its agents pummeling a group of men accused of Russian sympathies in the city of Dnipro. We will never take Russian soldiers prisoner. Let me just repeat that one. We will never take Russian soldiers prisoner. Ukraine's military flaunts its war crimes, while the Western media has focused squarely on allegations of Russian human rights abuses since the outbreak of the war. Ukrainian soldiers and pro-Ukrainian social media accounts have proudly exhibited sadistic war crimes, from field executions to the torture of captive soldiers. This March, a pro-Ukrainian Telegram channel called White Lives Matter. For all you Americans watching, this is a Nazi program of Nazi Ukrainians, and this program is called White Lives Matter. Wake the fuck up. Again, this March, a pro-Ukrainian Telegram channel called White Lives Matter released a video of Ukrainian soldiers calling the fiancé of a Russian prisoner of war and taunting her with the promises to castrate the captive Ukrainian soldiers use of the cell phones of dead Russian soldiers to mock and hector their relatives appears to be a common practice. In fact, the Ukrainian government has begun using notoriously invasive facial recognition technology from Clearview AI, a US tech company, to identify Russian casualties and taunt their relatives on social media. This April, a pro-Ukrainian Telegram channel called Fuck Russia, literally FCKRUSSIA 2022, Fuck Russia 22, posted a video depicting a Russian soldier with one of his eyes bandaged, suggesting it had begun gouging. It had been gouged during torture, and mocking him as a one-eyed pig. Yeah, because these are people we love to support in America. We love these people: fascists, Nazis, dictators, Saudi Arabia, all sorts of absolutely deplorable regimes throughout the world. And that's what we call democracy. Perhaps the most gruesome image to have appeared on social media in the recent weeks is the photo of a tortured Russian soldier who had one of his eyes gouged before he was killed. The accompanying post was captioned, "Looking for Nazis." Photos distributed by pro-Ukrainian Telegram channels showing captured, tortured, and executed Russian soldiers. Video has also emerged this April showing Ukrainian soldiers shooting defenseless Russian POWs in the legs outside of the city of Kharkov. A separate video published by Ukrainian and US-backed Georgian Legion soldiers showed the fighters carrying out field executions of wounded Russian captives near a village outside of Kiev. Ukrainian and Georgian Legion fighters celebrated after executing captive Russian soldiers on video. It is likely that these soldiers have been emboldened by their superiors' blessings. The commander of the Georgian Legion, which participated in the field executions of wounded Russian POWs, boasted this April that his unit freely engages in war crimes. Yes, we tie their hands and feet sometimes. I speak for the Georgian Legion. We will never take Russian soldiers prisoner. That's basically the same thing over and over. That just means we're not taking you prisoner, we're going to kill your ass. Right? If you don't get that by now, you really should have. Not a single one of them will be taken prisoner, he continues. Similarly, the head of the Ukrainian Military Medical Service stated in an interview with Ukrainian 24 that he issued an order to castrate all Russian men because they were subhuman and worse than cockroaches. You tell me how this is not Nazi ideology. And you tell me that this is cool for the West, the United States, and NATO to back them. To literally take U.S. taxpayer money and fund fucking Nazis in Ukraine. You tell me how that's right. You tell me. So, we fought fascists and Nazis in World War II. What? To become them? Insane. Ridiculous. Absolutely fucking nuts. Ukrainian officials present a woman tortured and killed by Azov as a victim of Russia, while Western media homes in on Russian human rights violations at home and inside Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has authorized a propaganda campaign known as Total War that includes the planting of bogus images and false stories to further implicate Russia. In one especially cynical example of the strategy, Ukraine 24, a TV channel where guests have called for the genocidal extermination of Russian children, published a photo this April depicting a female corpse branded with a bloody swastika on her stomach. Listen, if you want to read the full article by Max Blumenthal, I'll leave it in the description. But there is only so much horror I can read before I break down in fucking tears. And that's your war in Ukraine. A commentary from Reuters.com titled Ukraine's Nazi Problem in March 19th, 2018. 2018. As Ukraine's struggle against Russia and its proxies continues, Kiev must also contend with a growing problem behind the front lines. Far-right vigilantes who are willing to use intimidation and even violence to advance their agendas, and who often do so with the tacit approval of law enforcement agencies. A January 28th demonstration in Kiev by 600 members of the so-called National Militia, a newly formed ultranationalist group that vows to use force to establish order, illustrates this threat. While the group's Kiev launch was peaceful, National Militia members in, I don't know how to pronounce that, Balakalakas or whatever, stormed the city council meeting in the central Ukrainian town of Cherkasy. The following day, skirmishes with deputies and forcing them to pass a new budget. Many of the National Militia's members come from the Azov movement, one of the 30-odd privately funded volunteer battalions that, in the early days of the war, helped the regular army to defend Ukrainian territory against Russia's separatist proxies. So, the Donbass region, that is predominantly Russian-speaking people. In the civil war that I was just talking about at the beginning of this. This is a civil war in a country between Nazis and Russian-speaking Ukrainians. This is a civil war. And we got involved, just like we did, in order to make sure that it becomes a proxy war against Russia. Just like we have done for how many years now in Syria? Oh yeah, you don't know about that, huh? Yeah, well, that's been going on for a fucking long time. Same idea, same principle, and the same thing is going to be used in Taiwan against China in order to protect the U.S. economic hegemony that it has literally had for, well, now, well over a decade. I'm sorry, well over a century. But more specifically, at the end of World War II, we own the world. So everything that's going on, all these little proxy wars that no one seems to understand because the media doesn't want to talk about it, because the media it doesn't give a flying shit whether or not you understand anything whatsoever. It's doing that on purpose because that is the purpose. If you're ignorant, you're going to pick sides against, I don't know, Biden or Trump or whomever freaking fascist that they try to throw into office next. It's the same principle over and over. There's no difference between the two so-called political parties. We have no difference. It's all far right wing, and they all suck. And if you don't realize that, you're duped. But continuing. Although Azov uses Nazi-era symbolism and recruits neo-Nazis into its ranks, a recent article in Foreign Affairs downplayed any risks the group might pose, pointing out that, like other volunteer militias, Azov has been reined in through its integration into Ukraine's armed forces. While that is true, the private militias no longer rule the battlefront. It's the home front that Kiev needs to worry about now. When Russian President Vladimir Putin's seizure of Crimea 4 years ago, and this again is a 2018 article, when Russian President Vladimir Putin's seizure of Crimea 4 years ago first exposed the decrepit conditions of Ukraine's armed forces, right-wing militias such as Azov and Right Sector stepped into the breach, fending off the Russian-backed separatists while Ukraine's regular military regrouped. Though, as a result, many Ukrainians continue to regard the militias with gratitude and admiration. The more extreme among these groups promote an intolerant and illiberal ideology that will endanger Ukraine in the long term. Since the Crimean crisis, the militias have been formally integrated into Ukraine's armed forces, but some have resisted full integration. Azov, for example, runs its own children's training camp, and the careers section instructs recruits who wish to transfer to Azov from a regular military unit. According to Freedom House's Ukraine Project Director Matthew Schaaf, numerous organized radical right-wing groups exist in Ukraine. And while the volunteer battalions may have been officially integrated into the state structures, some of them have since spun off political and non-profit structures to implement their vision. Schaaf noted that an increase in patriotic discourse supporting Ukraine in its conflict with Russia has coincided with an apparent increase in both public hate speech, sometimes by public officials and magnified by the media, as well as violence towards vulnerable groups such as the LGBT community, an observation that is supported by a recent Council of Europe study. In recent months, Ukraine has experienced a wave of unchecked vigilantism. Institute Respublika, a local pro-democracy NGO, chances are it's not, reported that activists are frequently harassed by vigilantes when holding legal meetings or rallies related to politically controversial positions such as the promotion of LGBT rights or opposition to the war. Azov and other militias have attacked anti-fascist demonstrations, city council meetings, media outlets, art exhibitions, foreign students in Roma. Progressive activists describe a new climate of fear that they say has been intensifying ever since the last year's near-fatal stabbing of an anti-war activist, status, I don't know how to pronounce his name, sorry, which is believed to have been perpetrated by an extremist group named C14. The name refers to a 14-word slogan popular among white supremacists. Brutal attacks this month on International Women's Day marches in several Ukrainian cities prompted an unusual, forceful statement from Amnesty International, which warned that the Ukrainian state is rapidly losing its monopoly on violence. It's kind of funny how much they sound like America, huh? You know, the old United States, freedom and all that shit. Yeah. Freedom to become a fascist, authoritarian dictatorship. That's where we're going, and that's why we support Ukrainian fascists and Nazis today. It isn't that hard to fucking put the pieces together, folks. This is just a reality check. You don't like it? Fuck off. And you're not going to like the third part, and you're not going to like the fourth part. Ukraine is not the only country that must contend with a resurgence of the far right, but Kiev's recent efforts to incorporate independent armed groups into its regular armed forces, as well as continuing national sense of indebtedness to the militias for their defense of the homeland, make addressing the ultra-nationalist threat considerably more complicated than it is elsewhere. I'm not too sure about that. According to Schaef and the Institute Respublika, Ukrainian extremists are rarely punished for acts of violence. In some cases, such as C-14's January attack on the Remembrance Gathering for 2 murdered journalists, police actually detained peaceful demonstrators instead. Again, same shit happens right here in the United States. You have to be fucking willfully stupid or blind to not see the correlation here. You don't like what I have to say, fucking critique me down below in the comments section. But this shit is on. We don't have a democracy. We never truly had a democracy. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, while Europe was going towards fascism, the United States actually went towards a social democracy in the FDR administration. Now it's 2022. Europe's not all that much different, unfortunately. They've already got their social democracies to some degree, but the whole fucking EU is collapsing. And the United States is heading towards fascism. Actually, it's skyrocketing. It is racing towards fascism. To be clear, the Kremlin's claims that Ukraine is a hornet's nest of fascists are false. Far-right parties performed poorly in Ukraine's last parliamentary election. Again, this is 2018. Now it's full-blown freaking Nazism there. And Ukrainians react with alarm to the national militia's demonstration in Kiev. But connections between law enforcement agencies and extremists give Ukraine's Western allies ample reason for concern. Well, I don't see why. We seem to love them. We seem to love the Nazis. That's where I guess a difference between this commentary and today in 2022. We love the Nazis in Ukraine. We really do. We want Nazism here. We want fucking fascism here. The majority of fucking morons that believe in Trump, they want fucking fascism here. You have morons. C-14 and Kiev's city government recently signed an agreement allowing C-14 to establish a municipal guard to patrol the streets. If anyone doesn't know their history here, Jesus fucking Christ. 3 such militia-run guard forces are already registered in Kiev, and at least 21 operate in other cities. The brown shirts. It's probably time to bone up on your Nazi German history because, it's important to know now. Really important. It was important to know before all of this, but now since we're just racing towards fascism, I'd say it's pretty fucking important to understand all this shit now. Remember, this was an article from 2018, before Volodymyr Zelensky became president, and since then, neo-Nazis have infiltrated every aspect of the armed forces in Ukraine. The article continues. Yanukovych's People's Party status as the main partner in Ukraine's parliamentary coalition increases Yanukovych's leverage over Poroshenko's bloc. An attempt to fire Yanukovych could imperil Poroshenko's slim legislative majority and lead to earlier parliamentary elections. Given Poroshenko's current unpopularity, this is a scenario he will likely try to avoid. This is all old. Despite this, who gives a shit? This is all old. I don't know why I kept it in. There is no easy way to eradicate the virulent far-right extremism that has been poisoning Ukrainian politics and public life without vigorous and immediate efforts to counteract it. It may soon endanger the state itself. All right, so who gives a flying shit? This is all old news at this point. Western Ukraine has literally went straight into fascism, straight into Nazism. It doesn't matter if the Azov battalion changes its little emblems of the swastika. They still have plenty of swastika tattoos all over them, and I don't see them, inking over that shit anytime soon. So yes, I'm not saying Ukraine is all a bunch of Nazis. What I am saying is they have infiltrated every aspect of their armed forces. All right? They are anti-communist, and in definition, anti-communist is technically fascist. If you don't know what communist is, then that's your own fault for being that fucking ignorant. But in reality, being anti-communist in the real world, historically, has always been, guess what? You're a fascist. The author of the Reuters piece, Josh Cohen, is a former US AID project officer involved in managing economic reform projects in the former Soviet Union, US AID being a cutout of the CIA, which is tasked with destabilizing or overthrowing democratically elected governments across the world on behalf of US imperialism. However, he was not wrong about Nazis in Ukraine. Again, 2018. An article from multipolarista.com. CIA paramilitaries have been active in Ukraine training elite special operations forces to kill Russian-speaking Ukrainian separatists since soon after the 2014 US-sponsored coup. The US spy agency boasts that its influence cannot be overestimated. Yahoo News revealed this in a March 16th report titled Secret CIA Training Program in Ukraine Helped Kiev Prepare for Russian Invasion. The article details how the CIA paramilitaries began traveling to Ukraine in 2014 to train and advise forces to fight against Russian-speaking Ukrainian militants in the eastern Donbass region. These Russian-speaking independence fighters rose up against Kiev after a 2014 US-backed coup toppled democratically elected President Viktor Yanukovych, who had maintained a policy of political neutrality, balancing Ukraine between West and Russia. Washington instead installed a pro-NATO puppet regime that repressed the rights of the Russian-speaking minority in the east of the country. Yahoo News described the operation as a covert CIA training program run from Ukraine's eastern front lines, noting that it focused on developing Ukrainian special operations units, teaching them irregular warfare tactics. The U.S. spy agency additionally sent tactical specialists like snipers who also worked for the CIA Special Activities Center. Sounds like a fun job. It likewise developed secure communication systems for the Ukrainian forces. An anonymous CIA officer involved in the operation said, "Our job is to have an exponential impact on the Ukrainian forces." Another official told Yahoo News that the effect of the CIA program in Ukraine cannot be overestimated, and that the spy agency developed elite units that form a strong nucleus for Kiev's military. This CIA operation was secret, but publicly, Washington was sending Ukraine large numbers of weapons, and the U.S. military was openly training Ukrainian soldiers, Yahoo News noted, including by developing snipers and teaching fighters how to use Javelin anti-tank missiles and M141 bunker defeat munitions. After Russia invaded Ukraine this February 24th of 2022, the United States and other NATO member states sent the country at least 17,000 anti-tank weapons, including Javelin missiles, along with 2,000 Stinger anti-craft missiles. Some of these weapons have ended up in the hands of Ukrainian neo-Nazis from far-right extremist groups like Azov. Washington and its NATO military alliance have made it clear that they are fueling an insurgency inside Ukraine. After approving $350 million in weapons for Kiev in late February, the U.S. government this March passed a staggering $13.6 billion aid package for Ukraine, which includes $6.5 billion in military support. Yahoo News also reported in January that the CIA had since 2015 been training Ukrainian paramilitaries inside the United States. A former CIA officer stated clearly, weeks before Russia invaded, that the United States is training an insurgency. Added that the spy agency was teaching Ukrainian militants to kill Russians. Yahoo News falsely portrayed the conflict that raged from 2014 to 2022 in the Donbass as a fight between Ukrainians and Russians. In reality, researchers at the Pentagon-backed RAND Corporation admitted that even by Kiev's own estimates, the vast majority of rebel forces consisted of locals, not soldiers of the regular Russian military. From Consortium News. When asked by the nation's Katrina vanden Heuvel last month, what he thinks is preventing Kiev from signing a peace agreement with Russia, John Messerschmidt, whose analysis of this conflict has been prophetic for many years, replied as follows. I think that when Zelensky ran for president, he made it very clear that he wanted to work out an arrangement with Russia that ended the crisis in Ukraine, and he won. And what he tried to do was move towards implementing the Minsk II agreement. If you were going to shut down the conflict in Ukraine, you had to implement Minsk II. And Minsk II meant giving the Russian-speaking and the ethnic Russian population in the easternmost part of Ukraine, the Donbass region, a significant amount of autonomy, and you had to make the Russian language an official language of Ukraine. I think Zelensky found out very quickly that because of the Ukrainian right, it was impossible to implement Minsk II. Couldn't even implement Minsk I, for God's sakes. Therefore, even though the French and the Germans, and of course the Russians, were very interested in making Minsk II work because they wanted to shut down the crisis, they couldn't do it. In other words, the Ukrainian right was able to stymie Zelensky on that front. When Messerschmidt says that the Ukrainian right was able to stymie Zelensky, he doesn't mean by votes or by democratic processes. He means by threats and violence. In an article last month titled "Siding with Ukraine's Far Right, U.S. Sabotaged Zelensky's Mandate for Peace," journalist Aaron Mate wrote the following. In April 2019, Zelensky was elected with an overwhelming 73% of the vote on a promise to turn the tide. In his inaugural address the next month, Zelensky declared that he was not afraid to lose my own popularity, my ratings, and he was prepared to give up my own position as long as peace arrives. But Ukraine's powerful far-right and neo-Nazi militias made clear to Zelensky that reaching peace in the Donbass would have a much higher cost. No, he would lose his life. Right Sector co-founder Dmitry something or other, then the commander of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, responded 1 week after Zelensky's inaugural speech. He will hang on some tree on, I can't pronounce the fucking word, in some city or town, I'm guessing. If he betrays Ukraine and those people who died in the revolution and the war. Let me just repeat that real quick. And I'm not going to be able to pronounce the city or town's name. He will hang on some tree if he betrays Ukraine and those people who died in the revolution and the war. Zelensky cannot go forward as I've explained. I mean, his life is being threatened literally by quasi-fascist movement in Ukraine. He can't go forward with a full peace negotiations with Russia, with Putin, unless America has his back. Maybe that won't be enough. But unless the White House encourages this diplomacy, Zelensky has no chance of negotiating an end to the war. So the stakes are enormously high. In an article titled "Why Russia Went to War Now," Anti-War's Ted Snyder explains that Putin likely made the decision to invade because Kiev wasn't respecting Minsk II, and because future NATO membership with Ukraine was being kept on the table while weapons poured into the country from the US. And this was well before the invasion in February, by the way. Zelensky won't talk to the leaders of the Donbass. Minsk was dead, and Russia feared an imminent operation against the ethnic Russian population of the Donbass, Snyder writes. At the same time, Washington had become a leaky faucet on promises of flooding Ukraine with weapons and open doors to NATO. Two red lines Putin had clearly drawn. But, again, Zelensky could not enact Minsk because it hadn't been made abundantly clear to him that he faced a horrific death by a fascist lynch mob if he did. If the choice is between taking a chance on a U.S. proxy war and getting killed in the public square, I think many leaders around the world would opt for the former. So Zelensky made peace with the Nazis, whose will for Ukraine aligned with Washington's. This means that every major factor which led to Russia's decision to invade could have been nullified by the U.S. government. A guarantee of no NATO membership for Ukraine could have been made. The weapons supplies could have been stopped, and Zelensky and his government could have received protection from the U.S. military against the armed fascists who would repeat their violent acts of 2014 upon them. It would have been a win all around. We wouldn't be staring down the barrel of nuclear Armageddon. Ukraine would have been spared the horrors of an insane proxy war. Western powers wouldn't be sending arms to literal Nazi factions. And the U.S. would actually be protecting Ukrainian democracy instead of pretending to. But again, we are only indulging in fantasy here. Fighting Nazis, protecting democracy, and waging peace are not things the U.S. empire actually does in real life. The U.S. is the most tyrannical and murderous regime on earth by a truly massive margin, and it will happily risk the life of everyone on earth if it means securing planetary rule. But sometimes it's nice to imagine the kind of world we might live in if we weren't ruled by psychopaths. This concludes the end of part 2. Thank you for watching.